Today, we'll be taking a look at this GTX 660 Ti that I managed to pick up off eBay for just $65. Now, it has 2 gigabytes of GDDR5. It's got a custom cooler from ASUS. It's got some really thick heat pipes. It's got a DisplayPort and HDMI, a couple DVIs. It doesn't perform, as well as its older brother, the GTX 680, but that's to be expected. It's a cut down die. It performs pretty well in the benchmarks. The cooler managed to keep it cool even with the 2 6-pin connectors that this card has. It's not too big. You'll never use the SLI. It's a dead feature. I would say it performed pretty well for the price. It definitely performed better than something like a GT 730, which you'd be able to get for a similar price. It doesn't perform as well as like a 680, or if you can get lucky, that you could get a 780 for maybe around $80 to $90, depending on if you wait or if you can catch it off guard. But, let's get into the benchmarks. The first game was GTA 5. This ran at an average of 124, with 1 drop to 2 FPS, but I'm pretty sure that was from an explosion. It ran a little bit worse than it did on the GTX 680, but I had to end up using the same settings because they both had 2 gigabytes of GDDR5, and I didn't want to pass that limit. I chose this game first because, well, it was out around the time the card came out, and I don't see any issues with it. It's definitely a good card, and it plays the game pretty well. You'd be very happy to continue playing this game with that card, and if this was a game that you wanted to play, I would happily recommend the card. It's not too expensive, and if you have the power supply capable, you should absolutely use it. I actually only hit about 1.3 gigabytes of VRAM usage, so you could potentially bump some of the settings up to high and still see about 100 FPS, which would be perfect for a game like this. You really don't need a lot more, and it should not drop below maybe about 50 FPS if you bump the settings up. Up next, I chose BioShock Infinite, another game that would have been out around the time of this card's launch. Well, about a year later. I chose 1080p very high for this instead of 1440p like I did for the 680, because this card really just couldn't handle it at 1440. I mean, it barely stayed above 60 as it is at 1080p. It was a good card. It definitely ran the game at a frame rate that you would not have issues playing. It did drop a little bit when some gunfire and gunplay was going on, so you might want to lower the very high to high, but otherwise the game ran pretty smoothly. This game and the other 2 BioShock games went free to play on PC through Epic Games, which is another reason I chose it. Obviously, if you can run BioShock Infinite, you can run the other 2 as well. Even though they've been remastered, they're still not incredibly difficult to run, although they are still a bit buggy. Without any driver updates for this graphics card, it should still work because those games came out before its end of life, but just in case, if you have any problems, you might want to upgrade to a newer card. Next up, we have some of the competitive games that would absolutely run on a card like this. First, we have Valorant, which I ran at 1080p lowest settings. Now, this game actually ran nearly as well as it did on the GTX 680, which I think shows just how CPU bound this game is and not GPU bound. If the 660 Ti and the GTX 680 can both hit, well over 300, almost 400 FPS, then it's definitely a CPU bound game. Not having like a newer Ryzen or Intel 12th gen CPU would probably impact it a bit more, considering you'd probably pair a GTX 600 series card with like an i5 3rd gen or 4th gen, or maybe a Ryzen 1st or 2nd gen, since they're a lot cheaper now. You may have some difficulties reaching 300 to 400 FPS, but it shouldn't be too much of a problem. You'll still hit over 200, which will be perfect for a high refresh rate monitor. Which actually leads me into my biggest issue with both the 680 and the 660 Ti. I could not get the 144 Hz to work at all. 1080p, 1440p, nothing. HDMI or DisplayPort, I couldn't get it to work. I don't know if it's a driver issue, I don't know if it's a card issue, I don't know if it's a cable issue or a monitor issue, but I could not get it to work no matter what, which was somewhat disappointing. It didn't impact my play that much, but it is annoying. Next up, we have Fortnite. This ran at 65 FPS with a couple drops to the teens at 1080p low settings epic view distance. I would recommend heavily in changing the settings to competitive because it would really help with a card like this. The 680 ran a lot smoother in this game. I would suspect the extra horsepower and or memory bandwidth had something to do with that. If possible, I guess you could try to overclock the 660 Ti to try and reach it, but I'd really recommend you just lower the settings to competitive if you want to use this card for this game. Fortnite is definitely a game where you want to reach the highest FPS possible, and even though I could not get the 144Hz monitor to work, that doesn't mean you couldn't, and you would want the higher refresh rate anyways. Regardless of the monitor getting it, the higher FPS will definitely help. The last of the competitive games is Rocket League. I ran this at 1080p high settings, and I reached an average of 110 FPS with a couple lows down to the 30s. This was not that bad. Rocket League at 1080p is definitely doable on the 660 Ti. The 680 definitely ran the game a lot better. It ran it at 1440p with a somewhat similar frame rate, but that's just the kind of limitation you're going to have with a cut down model. This is not the flagship card, and it's not going to run like it. It's still a perfectly playable experience, and you shouldn't have any issues with this card if you want to play a game like Rocket League, Fortnite, Valorant, Counter-Strike, League of Legends, Dota. Any of those should work perfectly fine with a card like this. It's perfect for competitive games that aren't too graphically intensive. It could probably even run a game like Overwatch, maybe not Overwatch 2, because I know that apparently that's not super optimized, but it's also in beta. It's not even in beta anymore. It's no longer available. But Overwatch 1 is definitely playable if you turn the settings down. Next up, I have some games from my library that I would like to try. The first is Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. This is an open world action RPG based on the Dragon Ball anime. I ran it at 1080p high settings with FXAA, and I averaged about 47 FPS with some drops to the 30s and 20s. It was a pretty smooth experience. Battles weren't too bad, although when the action was heating up it did start to drop. Perhaps lowering the settings or dropping FXAA would smooth it out. You could also lower the resolution scaling to maybe 90%, render it closer to 900p. That could probably smooth it out. Unlike the GTX 680, it couldn't run this game at 60 FPS with very little drops. The 660 Ti is just a little underpowered for that. However, this does mean that basically any card of a higher class than the 660 Ti should be able to play this game fairly smoothly at 1080p high settings. I don't often see these kind of anime games referenced in benchmarks, so I figured that I would throw a couple in just to see how they ran. This one's a little bit older, but it's still a fun one. The next one I have is a bit newer and a lot more difficult to run, as you'll see. The next game is Tales of Arise. This game just came out a year ago, and it really shows. Utilizing Unreal Engine 4, this game has really, really nice graphics. At 1080p high settings, which was the same as the GTX 680, it can only average 23 FPS with major frame stutters and drops. Unlike the 680, which managed to run the game at about 40 FPS, this was half as much. I don't know if this was a memory bandwidth limitation problem, because it did seem like it was filling up and using up all of the VRAM, or if it was just the chip itself couldn't handle it. But the GTX 680 definitely ran the game a lot smoother, and I'm not sure why this slightly cut down card would run it so much worse. It really doesn't make much sense to me. Perhaps it does have something to do with the RAM, or maybe it is just the chip. Either way, you need at least a GTX 680 or maybe a 770 and above in order to play this game at 1080p. I would recommend something even more powerful so that you could stay above that 60 FPS limit. Tales of Arise is, after all, an action RPG, and the action combat is definitely more fun when you have the FPS above 60. The game does have caps above 60. You can cap it at 144 or perhaps even higher. Or, if you really wanted to, you could run the game at a higher resolution, like 1440p or 4K, but definitely not with the 660 Ti. The last game I have is Cyberpunk 2077. Now, I ran it at 1080p, lowest settings, with medium textures, and this time I did use FSR, I used balanced. Now, the GTX 680 managed to play the game at 1080p without FSR, and actually averaged about the same, if not a little bit higher, than the 660 Ti with FSR balanced. I don't know if it was a driver issue, I don't know if it was, again, something with the memory bandwidth. It definitely seems like whenever I fill the VRAM on the 660 Ti, it is far more negatively impacted than the GTX 680 was. So perhaps there's some kind of memory bandwidth limitation that is causing it to not be able to produce as many frames per second. I'm not 100% sure. I could look into more testing with that, but that's something that's up to you guys to decide. With FSR balanced, it still couldn't hit 30 FPS, so I don't think the FSR 2.0 would be able to save this card the way that it would the GTX 680. I would really recommend against buying at least a newer card, or a more powerful one like the 680, the 770, or perhaps something around that class, 1050 Ti, etc., etc. Those would all work much, much better. So, what did you guys think of the 660 Ti? Leave a comment, like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you didn't. I'll be reviewing some more old graphics cards that I ordered and some old CPUs and motherboards, etc. Whatever I can get, I'm going to be making videos of. So, stick around, subscribe, hit that notification bell, leave a comment if there's like a specific piece of hardware you'd like me to review. I can try to get it. So, thanks for watching. See ya.